ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ ਗੁਰਮੁਖ ਪਿਆਰਿਓ This commentary comes to you in the form of a series of audios that will attempt to establish the basic principles which we can apply in helping us understand Gurbani. Each audio will be devoted to one basic principle. After establishing the principle, we will attempt to apply the principle to Shabads from the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji. This is the first audio in this series. The principle that we will discuss here will be termed the Rahao principle. Now, a vast majority of Shabads in the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji have what we call a Rahao verse. Now, the Rahao verse is easy to identify because the word Rahao appears immediately after the verse ends. In all cases, the Rahao verse is located within the Shabad. In most cases, it is somewhere in the middle of the Shabad. In some cases, it is the first verse. In some cases, it is the final verse. But in all cases, the word Rahao is always placed at the end of that particular verse. Now, if we understand the significance of the Rahao verse, understanding the messages of the Shabd becomes easier. Understanding the Rahao verse further enables us to derive a more accurate understanding of the remaining verses of the Shabad. Understanding the Rahao verse further prevents us from the pitfalls of misunderstanding or misinterpreting the Shabad. So what is the significance of the Rahao verse? Rahao comes from the word Rahao. Now the dictionary translation of Rahao is pause. This, however, is the literal translation, and because it is literal, it is of no help. We don't pause at the Rahao verse, whether we are reading the Shabad or singing it. During Sahaj part and Akhanda part recitals, for instance, no one pauses at the Rahao verse, because if we did, the Akhanda part would take much longer than 48 hours, given that there are some 5,000 Rahaos in the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji. Some have argued that we should pause and contemplate at the Rahao verse. The counter-argument is that we should pause and contemplate at every verse, not just the Rahao verse. So this is what happens when we attempt to provide literal translations to word. Literally, Rahao means to pause, and such a literal translation is of no real help. So we need to look for contextual meaning of the word Rahao. What is meant by contextual? Perhaps an example of a simple word in English, but used in different contexts, would help us understand. So let's take the word stop, S-T-O-P. We know what it means in the literal sense, which is to halt doing whatever it is we are doing. But when stop is used in the context of a telegram, for instance, it means the end of a sentence. It means the punctuation mark of a full stop. This then is the contextual meaning, the telegram being the context. Now, when stop is used in the context of a road sign at a junction, it means to stop and look and then go. So in the context of a road sign, stop means to keep going after having made sure it is safe to do so. If in the context of a road sign, we understood stop to mean to halt whatever we are doing, which means the literal translation of stop, then all roads would become parking lots, and we would not be going anywhere. Similarly, if in the context of a telegram, we understood stop to mean a halt to reading, then no telegram would get read beyond the first sentence. So in order to understand the contextual meanings of the word Rahao, we need to first understand the different contexts of the Shabad. Every Shabad in the Guru Granth Sahib Ji has three basic contexts. So Rahao would then have three contextual meanings. Each would depend on the particular context. So what are these three contexts? First, every Shabad has a message. So in the context of the message, the Rahao verse contains the gist of the message, the crux of the message, the core of the message, the summary of the message. Second, every Shabad is a poetic composition. In other words, every Shabad is a poem. And poems have titles, poems have headings. So in the context of a poem, the Rahao is the title verse, the heading verse. Why is the title verse not at the top of the Shabad and placed within the Shabad? Because the top verse of the Shabad has been reserved for the name of the Rag and its author. For instance, the title verse is Rag Sohi Mahalla Chautha. So the Rahao verse has to move within the Shabad. Third, every Shabad is meant to be sung. So this is the third context. Within the Indian musical system, every song has one asthai and multiple antras. And the order of singing is asthai first, then antra 1, then asthai again, then antra 2, asthai again, then antra 3, and so on. And finally, after it's all done, asthai one more time. So in the context of singing Pyaryo, the Rahao verse is the asthai. All the other verses are antras. So if a particular Shabad has 6 verses, there will be 1 asthai, which is the Rahao, and 5 antras, which are non-Rahao verses. Now, if a 6-verse Shabad is to be sung as Kirtan, the asthai would be sung a total of 7 times, starting after each of the 5 antras, that's 6, and in the ending. So that makes it 7 times. The antras, however, will be sung only once each. Now, what is the reason for saying the Rahao is the asthai? Because in the context of the message of the Shabad, the asthai contains the gist of the message. The antras are illustrations or exemplifications of the gist. So it makes sense to sing the gist multiple times over and over again. So after listening to the Kirtan of the Shabad, the take home is that we internalize the asthai, the Rahao, the gist of the message in our minds because we heard it sung multiple times, 7 times, in this example of the 6-verse Shabad. So the Rahao or the gist becomes our take home. By the way, Pyaryo, this rule of the Rahao being the asthai is more often not followed by our Ragis and Kirtaniyas. While singing a Shabad, they usually pick their own asthai, which is not necessarily the Rahao verse. So their self-selected asthai will usually be the more catchy verse, the shorter verse, the simpler verse, or simply the verse that best fits their chosen tune. So what happens then is that the gist verse, Rahao, gets sung just once as an antra, and the example verse which they chose gets sung 7 times as the asthai. So the take-home is thus the example verse. We go back internalizing the example, but not the gist. We go back internalizing the catchy verse, but not the gist of the Shabad. So in summary, Pyaryo, Rahao has 3 contextual meanings. In the context of Kirtan, the Rahao verse is the predetermined asthai by the author of the Shabad, which is either our gurus or the Bhagats. Now, in the context of poetry, the Rahao verse is the title of the poetry. And in the context of the message of the Shabad, the Rahao verse is the one that contains the gist or the crux of the message. By extension, therefore, the Rahao verse is the most important verse of all. It is the Rahao verse that is exemplified and expanded in the remaining verses of the Shabad. It is also the Rahao verse that ties in all the non-Rahao verses. It is the Rahao verse that connects all non-Rahao verses to each other. The Rahao is the unifying verse, the core verse, the central verse that ties in all the peripheral verses into one single message of the Shabad. Understanding the Rahao verse first, therefore, Pyaryo, is crucial. Understanding the Rahao verse properly is equally crucial. The understanding of a Shabad must begin with the understanding of the Rahao verse. Now, before we conclude, 3 questions need to be answered. First, what about Shabads that have 2 or more Rahao verses? Long Shabads in the Guru Granth Sahib are often divided into parts or sections. For instance, there is a Shabad on page 642 of the Guru Granth Sahib Ji that has 10 verses. It's long and hence broken into 2 parts. The first part tells us all the ways people try to reach God but fail. The second part talks about the right way. So this Shabad has 2 Rahaos. The first Rahao provides the gist of the wrong ways, and the second, the gist of the correct ways. Pyare, in bid miln na jai, मैं किए कर्म अनेका हार पर्यो स्वामी के द्वारे दीजय बुद्ध बबेका रहाओ. So this is the first Rahao. It is a gist of the ways in which God cannot be reached. In bid miln na jai. Then 8 verses later we have this verse. Tero sevak e rang mata भयो कृपाल दीन दुख पंजन हर हर कीर्तन ए मनराता रहाओ दूजा. This is the second Rahao. It is a gist of the ways in which God can be reached. Har har kirtan e manrata. Now, another way of looking at it is that the first Rahao summarizes the problem and the second Rahao summarizes the solution. So that's the first question, Pyareo, Shabads with multiple Rahaos. The second question is, do long Banis have Rahao verses? Yes, some do. For instance, Sukhmani, which is perhaps the longest Bani in Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji, has a Rahao verse in it. Sukhmani, Sukh Amrit Prabhanam, Bhagta Jananke Man Visram Rahao. So this verse contains the gist of the messages of Sukhmani Sahib. The entire Bani revolves around this Rahao verse. Now, the third question is, what about Shabads that do not have Rahao verses? How do we apply the Rahao principle to these Shabads? In such Shabads, Pyareo, the gist of the message is always in the final verse. So all the rules that apply to the Rahao verse, number 1, it being the title of poetry, number 2, it being the style of the Kirtan, and thirdly, it being the gist verse, all these 3 things apply to the final verse of Shabads that are without Rahaos. In our second audio, we will attempt to apply the Rahao principle we discussed above to one Shabad by Bhakt Kabir Ji, which appears on page 870 of the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji. Gond, Naru Mare, नर कामना आवे पशु मरे 10 काज सवारे अपने कर्म की गत मैं क्या जानो बाबा रे Rahao. We will discuss this Shabad in the next audio by applying the Rahao principle. Till then, thank you for listening. प्यारे भूल चुक दी खिमा करनी. वाहिगुरु जी का खालसा, वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह.